When we talk about what makes us human, truly and deeply human, we have to talk about vulnerability. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's the birthplace of love, belonging, creativity, and courage. It is the very fabric that connects us to each other, and it is also the thread that makes our hearts most tender. When we show our vulnerability to another person, we are saying, "Here is the softest part of me. I trust you with it." But when someone takes that sacred offering and uses it against us, something deeply damaging occurs, not just within the relationship, but within the person who was vulnerable. That kind of betrayal is more than cruel. It's corrosive. And when weaponizing vulnerability becomes a pattern, a practice, or a personality trait, it reveals something darker. Something that is, quite frankly, demonic. Let me be clear. Calling something demonic in this context isn't about supernatural evil, it's about the systematic dismantling of what is good, sacred, and human. It's about the erosion of empathy, the abuse of trust, and the rejection of accountability. When someone weaponizes vulnerability, they are taking a moment of human courage, something raw and real, and turning it into ammunition. It's using someone's trauma as a punchline, their insecurity as a lever, or their grief as a tool for control. And when this is done intentionally and repeatedly, it reflects not just a lack of emotional maturity, but a willful disconnection from humanity. We often think of vulnerability as showing emotion or talking about past pain. And yes, those are parts of it. But vulnerability also shows up in small, quiet ways. It's admitting when we're afraid. It's trusting someone with a secret. It's asking for help. It's saying, "I made a mistake," or "I'm not okay." And when these moments are met with ridicule, manipulation, or cruelty, it teaches people, especially children, that being open is dangerous. That honesty gets punished. That tenderness equals weakness. And those lessons get internalized. They become shame. They become armor. And in some cases, they lead people to close off completely, not just from others but from themselves. When someone weaponizes your vulnerability, they're often trying to maintain control. Maybe they want to win an argument, maybe they want to keep you small, maybe they're trying to shift blame. But what's really happening is this: they're outsourcing their discomfort. They're saying, "I don't want to sit with my shame or my guilt or my own vulnerability, so I'll turn your pain into a weapon and aim it back at you." It's an avoidance tactic rooted in fear and insecurity, but it creates real damage. Emotional abuse, gaslighting, and manipulation are often built on this exact foundation. And because vulnerability is often shared in trust quietly, privately, the person who has been hurt might feel trapped. They might think, "Maybe I shouldn't have shared that," or worse, "This is my fault." That internalized blame is exactly what the manipulator relies on. Let's take a moment to consider how this shows up in relationships. Think of a partner who, in a moment of emotional intimacy, hears you express your fear of abandonment. Then later, during a disagreement, they throw it back at you with mocking contempt. "There you go again, being needy like always." That's weaponized vulnerability. Or consider a parent who, after their child shares something painful like a bullying experience at school, uses that story at a family gathering to make a joke, turning their child's pain into entertainment. That's weaponized vulnerability. Or a boss who encourages open feedback but later punishes an employee for sharing concerns, subtly sidelining them from projects. Again, that's weaponized vulnerability. These aren't isolated missteps, they are behaviors that teach people to hide, to silence themselves, to self-abandon. But here's the really painful part: when you've had your vulnerability weaponized enough times, you start doing the weaponizing yourself toward others, or even inward, against yourself. You start seeing vulnerability not as a source of connection, but as a threat. You preemptively hurt people before they can hurt you. You stop trusting. You numb. And this numbing isn't just emotional, it's physical, spiritual, relational. You become smaller, harder, more reactive. You might even begin to confuse strength with control and kindness with naivete. And then, the cycle repeats. In my research, I've seen over and over again that the antidote to shame, the fuel that makes weaponizing vulnerability possible, is empathy. Real, grounded, not performance empathy. Empathy requires us to sit with someone in their pain, without trying to fix it, judge it, or use it. It requires us to say, "I see you. I hear you. I'm with you in this." That kind of connection is what heals. That is what restores trust, and in some cases, it's what saves people from the abyss of isolation that this kind of emotional violence can cause. If you've ever had your vulnerability weaponized, I want you to know something: that wasn't your fault. You didn't deserve it. Your courage wasn't the problem. The person who took your softness and turned it into a blade, that's where the work needs to happen. And if you've ever found yourself weaponizing someone else's vulnerability, there's work for you too. But it starts with honesty. Not defensiveness, not justification, just honesty. Ask yourself, why did I feel the need to hurt them there? What was I trying to protect in myself? How can I do better? Because if we want to live in a world where people are safe to be real, to be seen, and to heal, then we have to stop turning vulnerability into a weapon. We have to name the behavior for what it is. We have to call it out. And we have to make the brave, often uncomfortable choice to be better. Not perfect. Better. More curious. More compassionate. More accountable. Because the truth is, when we honor someone's vulnerability, we help them grow. When we betray it, we shrink them and ourselves. And that's the real tragedy of weaponizing vulnerability. It doesn't just hurt the person on the receiving end. It breaks something in the person doing the harming too. It's a form of emotional sabotage that, over time, steals from everyone involved. But the good news? We can stop it. We can call it what it is. We can choose integrity over control, empathy over fear, and healing over harm. That's how we protect what is sacred in all of us. That's how we reclaim our humanity. Systematic dehumanization is not always loud. It doesn't always show up in cruelty that screams or violence that shocks the system. Often, it slips in quietly. It embeds itself in the way we talk about others, the way we justify mistreatment, the way we allow indifference to become the norm. At its core, dehumanization is the denial of another person's full humanity. It's reducing someone to a stereotype, a label, a function, or a problem. And when it happens over time through systems, patterns, or relationships, it becomes something far more dangerous than just a moment of disrespect. It becomes a way of thinking, a way of living, and eventually, a way of erasing someone's value altogether. When you dehumanize someone, you don't have to feel guilt for their suffering. You don't have to see their pain as your responsibility. You don't have to listen when they say, "This hurt me." Because in your mind, they're no longer a person with complexity, history, and emotion. They're an object. A burden. A thing to be managed, fixed, or feared. And when this mindset takes root in institutions, whether it's a workplace, a school, a government, or even a family, it allows harm to not only happen, but to be rationalized. In personal relationships, systematic dehumanization can look like constantly interrupting someone when they speak, dismissing their emotions as too much, or treating them like they only exist to meet your needs. It's when someone is never asked how they're feeling, but always expected to serve. It's when their silence is assumed to be consent. It's when they are not seen, only used. Over time, this erodes a person's sense of self. They begin to wonder if their thoughts matter, if their voice matters, if they matter. In larger systems, dehumanization becomes even more insidious. Think about how people talk about the homeless, the immigrants, the poor, the addicts. These are not inherently negative terms, but they are often stripped of individuality. The moment we stop using names, stories, and specifics is the moment we stop seeing people. Language becomes a tool for distancing ourselves. It creates an emotional buffer between us and them. And once someone is firmly placed in the them category, we stop feeling responsible for how they are treated. What's terrifying is that dehumanization doesn't require evil intent. It often thrives in spaces where people believe they're just being practical. Where they say, "This is just how it is," or "We don't have the time for that." It's in the workplace policies that treat employees like numbers instead of humans. It's in school systems that prioritize test scores over mental health. It's in justice systems that punish without ever asking why someone ended up where they did. And the worst part? The people being dehumanized often start to internalize the message. They begin to question their own worth. They begin to comply with the role they've been assigned, not because it fits them, but because they've been given no other option. One of the most heartbreaking effects of systematic dehumanization is the way it spreads. It teaches people how to treat others and how to accept treatment themselves. Children who grow up being ignored, belittled, or emotionally invalidated don't just carry wounds, they carry blueprints. They learn how to devalue others or how to disappear. And those lessons don't just fade. They replicate in friendships, in workplaces, in parenting, and in communities. Dehumanization becomes generational. But here's the truth, no one starts out wanting to dehumanize others. These behaviors usually come from fear, insecurity, or unresolved pain. When people feel powerless, they look for someone to exert power over. When they feel unseen, they look for someone to ignore. When they feel unworthy, they look for someone to shame. It becomes a cycle of projection, a way of displacing one's own discomfort. But that doesn't excuse the behavior. Naming the pain behind the harm isn't the same as justifying it. If anything, it's the first step toward breaking the cycle. Empathy is not just a feeling, it's a skill. And it's the antidote to dehumanization. It asks us to pause before reacting. To ask, what's the story here, instead of what's wrong with them. Empathy doesn't require us to agree with everyone. It doesn't mean condoning bad behavior. But it does demand that we recognize another person's full humanity before we judge, dismiss, or act. It means understanding that everyone has a context, a childhood, a history, a set of experiences that shaped them. When we remember that, we engage differently. We speak differently. We lead differently. If you've ever been on the receiving end of systematic dehumanization, I want to tell you something that maybe no one has said: it's not you. It was never about your worth. The way you were treated was a reflection of someone else's inability or refusal to see your humanity. You were not too much. You were not a problem. You were someone they chose to stop seeing. And that choice says everything about them and nothing about your value. And if you've found yourself dehumanizing others, maybe not on purpose, but in subtle, habitual ways, you still have the power to change. The first step is owning it. Saying, I didn't listen. I didn't ask. I didn't care enough to see. That kind of accountability is hard, but it's essential. Because the alternative is continuing to live in a world where people are reduced to roles, statistics, or enemies. And that's not a world any of us thrive in. The call here is simple, but not easy. It's to slow down. To see people. To ask questions. To listen for stories. To replace assumptions with curiosity and labels with compassion. It's to remember that every person you meet is fighting a battle you can't see, and that their pain, their joy, and their presence matter. Because the minute we decide someone doesn't count, we give ourselves permission to stop acting like we do. And that's when the real damage begins. But we can choose differently. We can choose to restore dignity where it's been stripped. We can choose to protect what is sacred in every person, starting with our willingness to look them in the eye and say, I see you. That is how we resist dehumanization. And that is how we begin to heal. Power is not inherently bad. In fact, when used well, power can be a force for healing, change, and protection. But when power becomes a substitute for connection, when it's used to dominate rather than to serve, and especially when it is fueled by fear, both the fear within and the fear instilled in others, it becomes something toxic. It becomes addictive. And like all addictions, it demands more and more while giving less and less. Addiction to power through fear is one of the most corrosive behaviors we can encounter, and when it shows up in relationships, workplaces, institutions, or families, it creates an environment where trust dies, courage is silenced, and authenticity becomes dangerous. The thing about fear is that it's primal. It triggers the most ancient parts of our brain, the parts designed to keep us safe in life or death situations. But when someone discovers that they can use fear to control others, to shut them down, to silence resistance or vulnerability, it becomes a seductive tool. Why negotiate when you can intimidate? Why listen when you can demand? Why be accountable when you can make people too afraid to challenge you? That's the logic of someone who's given up on connection and chosen control instead. Fear-based power often starts small. A raised voice here. A sarcastic insult there. A subtle punishment for speaking up. Over time, it escalates not because the person in power is growing stronger, but because their tolerance for vulnerability is shrinking. They can't handle uncertainty. They can't tolerate opposition. So they raise the stakes. They create an environment where people learn that survival means staying quiet. That dissent equals danger. That honesty has consequences. And before long, people stop being themselves not because they've changed, but because the fear has trained them to disappear. What's terrifying about this dynamic is how often it masquerades as leadership. People in positions of authority may claim they're just being firm or decisive, but really, they're using fear to avoid the discomfort of emotional labor. They don't want to hear that their behavior hurt someone. They don't want to be questioned. They don't want to admit they were wrong. So instead, they punish those who speak. They reward compliance. They confuse submission with respect. And the longer they get away with it, the more they believe it's justified. But make no mistake, this isn't strength. It's insecurity wearing a mask. Truly powerful people do not need to scare others into obedience. They don't need to control every narrative or shut down disagreement. Real power is rooted in humility, presence, and accountability. It invites people in. It creates safety. It says, I am strong enough to hear hard things and still stand in integrity. But when someone is addicted to power through fear, the idea of that kind of openness feels threatening. Because they've built their identity around being untouchable. And the moment they become too shareable human, they fear losing everything. The cost of this addiction is profound. People who operate this way often find themselves isolated. Not because they're not surrounded by others, but because those around them are afraid to be real. They get yes men, not truth tellers. They get silence, not trust. They may have compliance, but they never have commitment. And over time, they stop receiving real feedback altogether. They lose touch with what's actually happening around them. The fear they use to control others becomes a wall that also traps them inside. And here's the painful irony, people addicted to power through fear are often deeply afraid themselves. They fear irrelevance. They fear being exposed. They fear not being enough. And rather than sit with that fear, rather than face it and do the internal work, they externalize it. They project it. They turn it into dominance. They think, if I can control everything and everyone, maybe I'll never have to face what I'm afraid of in myself. But that never works. Because the fear doesn't go away, it just gets louder, more desperate, more dangerous. In families, this shows up in parents who shame rather than guide, who confuse obedience with love, who expect perfection but offer no empathy. In workplaces, it looks like bosses who micromanage, threaten, or manipulate to maintain control. In communities, it looks like leaders who demonize the other, stoke division, and build loyalty not through shared values, but through shared enemies. And in all of these places, the result is the same: people shrink. They numb. They perform. And they begin to believe that their voice doesn't matter. But here's the truth: fear may get results in the short term, but it destroys relationships in the long term. You can force someone to obey, but you can't force them to trust you. You can silence someone, but you can't kill the truth they're carrying. You can demand perfection, but you'll never inspire greatness. Greatness requires vulnerability. Creativity requires risk. Innovation requires safety. And none of those things can survive in an environment ruled by fear. If you've ever been on the receiving end of this kind of power, know that you are not weak for feeling afraid. Your nervous system is responding exactly as it should in an unsafe environment. But also know this: your fear does not define your worth. The person trying to control you through fear is operating from their own place of pain and avoidance. That does not excuse them. It simply reminds you that their behavior is about them, not you. And if you recognize yourself in this addiction to power through fear, I want to say this gently but clearly: there is another way. You do not have to keep controlling people to feel safe. You do not have to lead with threats to feel respected. You do not have to be feared to be worthy. The work is hard. It means confronting your own vulnerability, owning your mistakes, and learning how to be with people rather than above them. But that is where healing begins. That is where real power, the kind rooted in connection, not control, starts to grow. In the end, power built on fear is always fragile. It isolates. It hardens. It breaks the very connections it seeks to control. But power rooted in courage, empathy, and integrity? That kind of power creates movements. It builds bridges. It transforms lives. And most importantly, it frees not just others but you. There's something deeply unsettling about watching someone take pleasure in the downfall of others. We've all seen it, maybe not always in obvious or dramatic ways, but in subtle glimmers, a smirk when someone else is embarrassed, a sense of satisfaction when another person's mistake is exposed, or even an eagerness to share gossip that paints someone else in the worst possible light. When a person delights in destruction, when they feel joy, satisfaction, or power from someone else's pain, it reveals something far deeper than just cruelty. It shows a disconnection from empathy, a fracture in one's relationship with their own worth, and often, a long history of unresolved hurt that's been turned outward rather than inward. At its core, this behavior is about power. Not the kind of power that uplifts or protects, but the kind that feeds on the weakness of others. It's the illusion of elevation through comparison. If they're lower, then maybe I'm higher. If they're humiliated, then maybe I'm safe. If they fail, then maybe I'm good enough. It's a survival mechanism that's been twisted into something toxic. And while it might feel satisfying in the moment, like a hit of dopamine when someone else stumbles, it never leads to real joy. Because real joy isn't comparative. It doesn't need someone else's suffering as a reference point. Delighting in destruction can start small and feel almost socially acceptable. Think of how normalized it's become to mock celebrities when they're vulnerable, to cheer when a rival gets what they deserve, or to gossip about someone who's struggling. These moments don't always look evil on the surface, they're often cloaked in humor, sarcasm, or just being real. But behind them is something darker, a refusal to recognize another human being's complexity, dignity, and right to be more than just a source of entertainment or comparison. When people engage in this kind of behavior regularly, it often signals an internal emptiness. Instead of turning inward and asking hard questions like, "Why am I hurting?" or "Why do I feel small?" they externalize that pain. They look for others to knock down because building themselves up feels impossible. And let's be honest, destruction is easier than creation. Mocking someone's art, someone's vulnerability, someone's risk, that takes seconds. Creating something yourself? Showing up, being seen, failing publicly, that takes real courage. People who delight in destruction often lack that courage, and so they hide behind ridicule. This mindset is also deeply contagious. In group settings, especially in toxic workplaces, social circles, or online communities, people can start to bond over destruction. They feel united by shared disdain rather than shared dreams. They mock, exclude, and diminish others as a way to maintain belonging. But this kind of belonging is counterfeit. It's built not on love, but on fear. Because deep down, everyone in that circle knows, if I slip, if I show weakness, I'll be next. So they perform, they attack first, or they stay silent when harm is done because it's safer to side with the destroyer than to risk being destroyed. In families, this behavior can show up in more subtle but equally painful ways. A parent who mocks a child's dreams under the guise of toughening them up. A sibling who belittles rather than supports. A partner who takes joy in proving the other wrong. Over time, these dynamics teach people that their value is conditional, that their failures are entertainment, and their pain is deserved. And once someone internalizes that message, they either shut down emotionally or begin replicating the pattern with others. The truth is, delight in destruction is often inherited. People who harm others usually learned that harm was the language of power in their early lives. Maybe they were ridiculed for being sensitive. Maybe their vulnerability was punished. Maybe they saw love only expressed as control or criticism. Whatever the root, the result is the same. They come to believe that the only way to feel strong is to make others feel small. That's not an excuse, it's a context. And understanding that context is what allows us to interrupt the cycle, not excuse the behavior. We also need to talk about how this behavior is rewarded. In today's culture, outrage sells. Mockery gets clicks. Destruction can go viral. And the people who engage in it often get attention, sometimes even praise. But attention isn't the same as connection. You can be seen by millions and still feel completely alone. That's the hidden cost of delighting in destruction, the loneliness. Because once people start associating you with harm, they stop trusting you with their hearts. You become feared, not loved. Respected maybe, but never safe. And deep down, that kind of existence is hollow. If you've ever been on the receiving end of someone who delights in your failure, Please hear this, your worth was never dependent on their opinion of you. Their joy in your pain does not make your pain less real or less valid. In fact, it says everything about them and nothing about you. You are not weak for being wounded by it. You are human. And your ability to keep showing up, to stay soft, to keep creating and loving and risking, that is strength. And if you see yourself in this pattern, if you've caught yourself feeling a little too satisfied by someone else's pain, it's not too late to shift. The first step is radical honesty. What is hurting inside me that makes this feel good? Then, what would it mean to stop participating in this cycle? This is hard work. It requires vulnerability, reflection, and often, the humility to make amends. But it is the only way to return to ourselves. Because no one who truly feels worthy needs to destroy others to feel powerful. Real power lifts. It heals. It transforms. The work here is choosing empathy over ego. Choosing presence over performance. Choosing to celebrate people instead of waiting for them to fall. And choosing to be the kind of person who builds what others try to burn down. That kind of person changes the world not through dominance, but through courage.